thank you, Kinchi and Global University for Sustainability for organizing this, for keeping the flame, actually the flame of Samir kind of burns in all of our hearts and minds, but it's lovely to have this coming together to recognize his contribution. And so thank you so much for organizing this. And also for really interesting interventions, very profound interventions, in fact, that we've had so far. I'm going to try and emphasize the class dimension of what we've been talking about so far, because I think it was very much part of Samir's own perspective. And I want to position this in terms of what I think imperialism is, which I believe is along the lines that Samir himself talked about and Prabhat Patnaik and others have mentioned, which is that it's a struggle over economic territory by large capital. And it is that struggle of large capital amongst themselves, which is aided and abetted by the nation states. So it's not necessarily, it's not just country to country. It's not, in fact, at all country to country. It is capital versus people everywhere. The tragedy is that capital is able to persuade people in their own countries that, in fact, it is about this country versus that country. But it's not. It's about the economic territory that large capital wants to control. And that economic territory includes labor, it includes nature, it includes access to markets, and of course, increasingly knowledge and technology, or what is now codified as intellectual property rights. So with that broad definition in mind, I think it's important then to look at the way in which imperialism has changed or is changing, and what that means for the delinking process. So I think it's evident and has been very beautifully outlined by everyone so far that it's no longer hyper-imperialism. The phase of globalization that was also the hyper-imperialist phase with the US in complete dominance is over. We now have competing powers, and that gives us instability, it gives us danger, but it also gives us potential. All periods of this kind of instability have been periods when you've got autonomous industrialization in developing countries and you have different possibilities for development. But of course, now is a very different time. We have a new context with very large global public goods or global public bads, really. We have climate change, we have health pandemics, we have the spillover effects of economic and social tensions that end up with military consequences as well. And so here I think we need to look at this, again, in terms of some concepts that Samir outlined so beautifully. In his work, Samir talked about 5 monopolies that were essential to the global economic order, yes? The monopoly over technology, the monopoly over finance, the monopoly over access to natural resources, the monopoly over communication and media, and the monopoly over the means of mass destruction. I think these are such essential ideas today because we are seeing these play out, and the attempts to maintain these monopolies becoming ever more severe and more critical. But then there is another concept that Samir highlighted, which was he had a sort of complex notion of class structures. But one of the classes that he definitely emphasized was the dependent bourgeoisie in, shall we say, the non-imperialist countries, the countries who were the objects of imperialism. And I think that's very important. Just as imperialism is not about one country versus another, it's not only the big capital in big rich countries versus everybody else. It's big capital and dependent bourgeoisie in our own countries versus our own people as well. So it's a much more complex situation in which we have to look at these changes in global economic and political power. These changes are occurring, but they are in process. They are certainly not complete. This process is far from complete. The whole idea I'm right now, as we speak, I'm speaking from the US, and it's extraordinary to see the extent to which the media has pushed this whole idea of the fear of China, that, that the US population will become slaves of China and they're going to take over the world and so on, without recognizing that China is still in that process of developing. And what the US is doing at the moment is everything in its power to prevent that process from coming towards a possible conclusion. The trade war that was mentioned, and I agree with Professor Wen that there is a significant trade war, but it's not about trade. It's about technology. That war was always about preventing China from accessing or creating the top technologies, the frontline and leading technologies in the world, whether in terms of all of the productive forces or communication and media. And I think the recent changes that we have seen in industrial policy in the United States and in Europe have to be seen in that light. That is to say that the recent changes in the United States and Europe are very clearly protectionist, and they are protective of domestic production capacity. They are protective of domestic employment. But most of all, they are protective of knowledge and technology. So one of the interesting features of globalization that we had experienced in the past, since the 1990s, was that trade got globalized, finance got globalized, technology really did not, except for one very big exception, which I'll come to. So the intellectual property rights regime was absolutely critical in continuing that monopoly over knowledge. Labor did not get globalized, capital got globalized. And of course, that meant a dramatic shift in bargaining power. Basically, globalization meant a shift in bargaining power in favor of capital versus labor, because there was an increase in globalized labor supply with the greater integration of China and to some extent India. And this could be used to keep the power of workers in the rich countries constrained. And it dramatically increased the bargaining power of capital, based in the US, based in Europe, but everywhere, the power of capital increased. Knowledge control, the ability to monopolize knowledge, has been particularly marked because it was legalized in the intellectual property rights regime of the WTO. But after that, with a range of bilateral agreements, of plurilateral agreements, comprehensive economic partnership agreements, many of them contain these clauses or chapters on intellectual property. In fact, even in bilateral investment treaties, of which there are thousands in the world today, there are nearly 3,000, investment includes intellectual property. So these are also being interpreted in ways that will monopolize knowledge further. They are going to do whatever they can. And certainly large capital in the rich countries, which is very much, shall we say, in favor of that particular control, will not allow any further transfers, not just to China, but to anyone. And that has implications for industrialization for the rest of us, because this access to knowledge is now critical. It's critical in all sorts of ways, of course, for industrialization, but also to maintain public health, also to ensure that we can cope with climate change. not just mitigation, but even adaptation now requires more and more of the knowledge, a lot of which is available, but is not being adequately shared. And then, of course, the protectionist strategies that we are seeing are going to make it harder to use export-oriented industrialization, which was another significant strategy of the Chinese, as I've called it, the strategic linking. That, again, is less available because of changes in the types of production, the much greater use of the artificial intelligence, robotization, and so on, which means that a lot of production can be reshored, brought back to national boundaries. A lot of the production can rely on less and less labor. And it means that industrialization is no longer the means for shifting labor from agriculture to industry, because it's not going to employ more labor. That, again, is a big problem for most of the global majority countries, because we haven't done that. We have not shifted labor from low productivity to higher productivity activities. But on the other hand, we desperately still need to industrialize, because industrialization generates synergies, it enables innovation, it allows the productive forces to advance, it provides some kind of stability and resilience to economic shocks. It also improves the condition of women. So we need to industrialize, but it's harder to industrialize. So I think that's the context in which we have to look for the rest of us, for the global majority countries that are not the rich countries or China, because I think China is in a completely different space at the moment. What do the rest of us do? And I think for the rest of us, we really have to think of delinking in a slightly different way in terms of regional and plurilateral initiatives. They can be what the US once called the coalitions of the willing. I think we have to have our own coalitions of the willing as a new means of generating economies of scale, exchanging knowledge and technology, enabling finance. It's important to have these coalitions because that way we can also impact the multilateral processes. We know that the current international financial architecture is extremely unjust, unequal, and it's not going to change anytime soon because the rich countries will prevent it, and capital in the rich countries will prevent it. But if there is enough combinations of countries doing things independently, and if they fear irrelevance, then these institutions also will change. I'm thinking of regional development banks. I'm thinking of different types of trade agreements and finance agreements. I'm thinking of tax cooperation. 2 days from now in Latin America, there will be a big conference for the region on how Latin American countries can do tax cooperation. Because the OECD process for tax cooperation turned out to be another instrument of imperialism. And it has resulted in a compromise that is bad for the developing world. In Latin America, this initiative, I think it has huge potential. And we should learn from it and perhaps engage with it and think of other ways of doing that. Because that will allow Latin American countries not just to share information, but also to push the multilateral system to get a more equitable tax treaty, a tax convention, to tax multinationals the same rate as domestic corporations, to ensure that we can tax extreme wealth, to stop illicit financial flows. It's very important to do all of that. And final point, I've talked for too long already, but the final point I want to emphasize is that we are getting trade deglobalization. It's happening. Yeah, it's happening because the North is pushing it. But we are not getting enough financial deglobalization. And that's what we have to do. we have to de-link in finance, because as long as we remain integrated in these global capital markets, then all the other things that I've talked about will become much more difficult, if not impossible. So we have to think of different means of financial de-linking. And there are some options out there. Once again, this is something that is almost being assisted by the rich countries. If everyone feels that if the US government decides they don't like you, they can freeze your assets, they can commandeer your assets to do what they like with it, they can do anything, then less and less people will be interested in holding dollar assets. So we have to think of different means of financial deglobalization, particularly for trade credit, for emergency finance, for sharing of reserves in crises. And I think those are ways that Samir would also have celebrated. So I think there are ways we can cope with what is a very difficult situation. And a lot of that inspiration will come from Samir Amin's own work. Thanks.
南方为什么是南方？南方为什么是这个现状？我们到底将来会是一个什么样的发展方向？大家好，我是温铁军。我们准备了一个很重要的系列课程，统称为叫做南方世界观，希望大家适当的集中点精力，能够跟我们一起把这个5讲24节的课上下来。